Welcome to the Decision Lab podcast, the sanctuary for wellness professionals like therapists, coaches, creators, and more who are looking to over-deliver to their clients.
We uncover the truth behind cutting-edge wellness products by going straight to the founder.
We use our backgrounds in neuroscience, chemical engineering, and marketing to ask the hard questions in order to eliminate bias, misinformation, and fancy marketing language,
allowing you to make better wellness decisions and recommendations for yourself and your clients.
So if you're a leader in the health and wellness space, welcome. This podcast was designed for you.
Join us every week for interviews that will change how you think about wellness. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Decision Lab podcast. Today, we are talking to Ben Wisbey. Ben is a performance scientist with 2 decades of experience helping elite athletes perform at their peak. Over the last 5 years, he has turned that experience towards mental performance. Combining his expertise with his passion for productivity, he founded Pylot to create a wearable to track mental energy, which we will dive all the way into. Prior to Pylot, Ben founded FitSense Australia, an organization dedicated to improving staff health for corporate clients and monitoring the performance of professional sports teams. This work led him to establish Ready Active based on proprietary algorithms for measuring individuals' physical readiness for training and performance. Ready Active was later acquired by Jaybird, which has since become a Logitech brand. Ben is an innovator in the realm of smart technology and leverages his experience to help others unlock their full potential. Welcome to the Decision Lab podcast, Ben. We're so grateful to have you today.
Yeah, thank you very much. Really excited to be here and looking forward to having a chat.
Man, the myth, the legend. Something that I like to ask people when we get started that never seems to make our prep notes glowy is if you had to describe yourself in 3 words, what 3 words do you think your parents would describe you with?
I think competitive being loves to win, but not very good at anything. So it's a poor mix, that one. Twice. I'm definitely not the extrovert. I'm not sure what the third one would be. You put me on the spot there. They're hard questions, but definitely quiet and competitive is probably some key things I am.
I like that. And if I had known you in middle school, would I have known you'd be here today?
Yeah, probably. I don't think it's far off track. I'm not one that's changed a lot. I like routine, and I have done for my whole life. And I guess that the way I acted at school is probably not dissimilar to how I've gone about the rest of my life.
Do you have an example?
I can remember as a 15 or 16-year-old that I would get up at 6 o'clock in the morning. I'd go for a run. I'd go home and I'd study. I'd go to school, I'd come home and I'd do the same in reverse, and it was just this very regimented life. And I guess for a lot of people that's very boring. Even to this day, as somebody in their 40s, that's still how I live my life, and that's still what I get excited about. So I can understand that most other people don't enjoy that regimented lifestyle, but yeah, I find pleasure in the routine, I guess.
Where'd you learn that? Like, was your mom or your dad like that? Was there somebody like a teacher or a mentor? Like, how did you learn that?
Yeah, I'm not sure, but both my parents worked pretty hard. My dad had his own business and was always hardworking and pretty sharp in terms of the way they went about life, and also very controlled, not out doing a whole lot apart from work and family. But I'm not sure where the obsession with routine and especially with sport and exercise came from, because my family, they were active, but they weren't heavily into sport in any way. And I guess that sport, especially in the early part of my working career, was what life was. And even now, personally for me, that carries into my daily routine, where I still have to exercise on a daily basis and then get stuck into work, even though there may not sometimes be pressing demands. It's something that without exercising and work, I don't feel as though I've completed a good day.
I definitely feel that. I had to leave early today because I was like, damn, I need to go lift. I need to get this in.
We both did. I think we both worked out for this.
There you go.
I feel that's a good obsession to have, that one.
I agree. Was it lifting, running? Do you remember what the first like exercise or like performance thing that you got into was?
Yeah, when I was as a kid, a 15, 16-year-old, I'd go for a half-hour run in the morning, and then I'd do 90 minutes of strength and cardio stuff at night, and that was every day. As I got older, that was just an obsession with distance running. So the weightlifting went out the window, and now I'm just very weak. But yes, the obsession became with endurance activities over time.
And that's just something you randomly picked up? Like you just decided, I'm just going to start running for 30 minutes every day at 15? Or like you just
I don't know exactly where it started, but very quickly became an obsession. I remember at 16 going up, just run 100 days in a row consecutively. And I'm not sure where that started because neither of my parents ran. I didn't know anyone that ran. I don't know. You start doing these things, and then suddenly you're like, that's enjoyable, and off you go. And I think now, even having kids myself, you find that the key is to expose them to a wide range of activities and see what they gravitate to. And I guess that's probably the way I went about it as a kid. You try different things, and finally you stumble across something and go, oh, this actually really suits me, and I like doing it, and then you fall in love with it.
I love it.
And then how did you get into performance science? So was there a love of running and then just wanting to get better and better, or is this something that you almost fell into?
Yeah, so working in any sport is really difficult. So even before I left school, I had this love for sport and getting the most out of the human body. And so I then went to university to study human physiology, and at that same time, I'd love to get some work experience in the professional sporting space, and basically working sports science as a physiologist there. And so I managed to get a bit of early work experience, and then that led to a little bit of sort of part-time work in that space. So I was both studying and doing this bit of part-time work with an elite sports academy in Australia. And basically then it evolved from there. So, suddenly my personal passion as a kid of being able to run, suddenly you're working with professional cycling teams and, people who are going to the Olympics or competing for world champs in cycling. So it's like, right, completely different level, but now this desire and this fascination I have with human performance, I'm able to do it as a job. And so I loved every moment of that. It's completely fascinating when your work and your passion combine, because you can really commit every part of your life to it. And so that was, really exciting. So it was the ability to be able to, work with sports that I really love, like cycling, but also to have experience with other sports that maybe I'd had less exposure to before, like a lot of different team sports, or even, trying to identify youth athletes into trying to determine what sports they might be best suited for in the Australian sporting system, where they go around looking for athletes who may be misplaced. Like they might be good athletes, but maybe they're doing sport A when their actual talent is sport B, and can they be directed into there? So really a wide range of exposure that I had there, which was really exciting and enjoyable.
How does one become like a performance scientist? And I know US versus Australia, kind of slightly different schooling and different things like that. Is it like a master's PhD thing? And then what are you doing like day to day generally when you're a performance science?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I only did an undergrad, and I never went on to do a PhD like some of my colleagues, mainly because I started working with elite athletes, before I'd even finished university. And that was the exciting part for me. It was the study was the bit that had to be done to learn and help me improve at it. But I didn't have that academic passion, just to do research for research's sake. So the idea of doing a PhD never really got to me, whereas a lot of my colleagues, they're PhDs in this space. So I guess that the performance scientist, another word for it would be a sports scientist. That's what I'd always used to say I was, but now working in the space of mental performance, I use the word performance scientist because it's a bit broader. In terms of day to day, I guess that's what made it really fun. Like there's a lot of testing of athletes. So, for a cyclist, for example, that might be in the lab where you're doing a VO2 test on a stationary bike and doing gas analysis and blood analysis, etc. Or you could be hanging out the window of a car while they're cycling along, getting a blood lactate reading from their ear. Or, the next day you could be, testing a football, like a soccer team in terms of their endurance or speed. And then you're working with the coaches to try and pull that information together and say, well, what does this mean for the athlete? And especially with the sports academy I was at, a lot of it was about developing athletes. So sort of in that sort of 16 to 20-year-old space. Because as a general rule in Australia, when they're getting to an older age and being successful, they move overseas. So, if they're, for example, an elite soccer player who's in their early 20s, they're not in Australia anymore. Whereas the cyclists were a little bit different, which is why I ended up spending a lot of time with them, is because you spend our winter dealing with the youth cyclists, And then our summer, the pros would come back from the European season, and they'd be back home, and you'd be working with them. So you get this really interesting exposure from 15-year-old kids through to a guy in the mid-20s who's racing the Tour de France each year. So it's very interesting, the variety of work you get.
From all of this work with elite athletes, are there any productivity and performance hacks that you've learned? Like maybe what are your top 3?
I think that the productivity in sport are sort of separate, but the thing that they're similar in, and I guess the thing that fascinates me about both, is they're trying to get the most out of yourself in a sustainable manner. And they're just, the athlete is obviously trying to get the most out of themselves physically and be able to repeat that throughout their whole season, whereas the person who's studying or working from a productivity point of view is trying to get the most out of themselves from a work aspect in an ongoing manner. So I think that as I've ventured down this path of our project with Pylot and looking at mental performance, there's more and more that I associate with my sports background, that we used to say this was about physical performance, but the exact same thing applies now around mental performance and productivity. And I think that they're quite diverse. And you often hear this saying of the corporate athlete, when people are talking about workers. And I think it's actually closer to the truth than I ever gave it credit for, because I think if we want to perform at our best, then we need to treat ourselves like athletes. And that means where, your athletes are rarely training hard day after day after day after day, year round. And therefore it's not sensible to start doing that with workers if we're actually trying to get them to perform at their best and do that in a sustainable manner.
I literally have never understood the importance of rest so thoroughly as I just did right now. That is such a great point. Is there any misconceptions about performance for these corporate athletes, if you will, or anybody in general? But
well, I guess that in my mind, once again relating it to an athlete, then if you're working, then it's fine to do big bursts, right? Something's due this week. It's a really intense burst. There's a big moment at work. There's a lot of stress, etc. Then you step up to that and you do that. But then the next day or the next week, then you can't keep doing that. And I think that's where associating that with athletes. If they're aiming for a competition, then yes, there's these big training blocks. It's all very intense. It ramps up. But then after that, it doesn't just go again the next week. Because if they want to be able to perform again, they know they need that downtime. And I think that's the case for us as individuals from a mental performance point of view, is we need to be able to accommodate that. I see a lot of people starting to do that, probably on the back of COVID. There seems to be a lot more awareness about managing your time and energy better. And if you're in a freelance position, and I say freelance as in you're in control of your own work schedule, then I see a lot more people doing that and having that awareness. But I guess the challenge is there's still a lot of larger organisations that the person's not necessarily being considered as an individual, and it's just all about push, push, push.
Got it. So the core misconception would be that if you can't just keep pushing, you have to take time to rest.
100%. And whether that's within a day itself, over the course of the week, or over the longer term, you need these periods of rest on all 3 of those scales.
Was there a moment you were performing at your lowest, and why, and how'd you fix it?
Well, I guess from a mental performance point of view, that's actually what led us to start looking at the idea that led to Pylot, which was, so my Australian company, had some IP around monitoring physical performance, end up getting purchased, and a few years later I ended up working at Logitech, which is a tech company in the US, and I worked remotely and my whole team was remote. But I'm here in New Zealand, so I'd wake up and be in meetings pretty much from 6 o'clock in the morning, and the US work day would finish at about my midday. And it'd be all meetings, emails, hectic. That's right. The US is finished for the day. Right, what's on my list for deep work I need to achieve today? And then I'd sit there and be, geez, I'm tired. I feel as though I'm struggling a little bit here. Am I just being lazy, or am I actually fatigued and run down from that busy morning? And that was probably the thing that clicked for me and went, right, I need to try and understand this better. So, because I can't keep doing this and expect to perform at my best. And then it was, led to the question as well, am I actually just fatigued? And if I am fatigued, then I need to get on top of that before coming back to try and work on my task successfully.
Got it. That's interesting. Something that we like to ask a lot of people is, you mentioned mental performance, and I'm huge on mental and emotional health. Like, it's where I spend most of my time. Something I'm curious about, especially with someone who's worked with elite athletes, imposter syndrome. Have you ever experienced it yourself? And do you have any hacks for that, or any things that you've done to like help with that?
Don't we all experience that at some point?
Yes.
I think we all get to a point where you think, well, why am I being given recognition I don't deserve, or have I achieved something that maybe was luck more than the hard work I put in? I don't think there's any solution to it except that you make your own scenario. So whether it's luck or good planning or however you end up in this specific space, it's very rare that people just accidentally have that happen to them. So there's obviously a degree of luck in any success, but I think you make your own luck and you make your own destiny. So I think it's really just not putting that pressure on yourself in terms of thinking you don't deserve where you've got to, and rolling with it, enjoying it, because it can easily disappear as quickly as it came.
And how do you do that for yourself?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that as you get older, then you probably look back at your experiences, and each change in life is maybe not less meaningful, but it's less dramatic in terms of how you interpret it. So definitely, when I was younger, then, there's a desire to work harder to try and achieve something. And then when you achieve something and you get some recognition for something, then you potentially go, did I deserve that? But then I always found that, okay, any success is pretty transient, and you're then looking at the next thing. And maybe that's part of the athletic background, in that, you can go and win a world championships with an athlete, but then, the week after, everyone's forgotten about that, and it's the next event that's the key thing. And I think it's very much the same in terms of how I view things from a work success point of view. Is you have success, you enjoy it momentarily, and then you try and move on and say, right, what's next? What's the next challenge?
I get that. I feel that so much. I work a lot with anxious achievers, is what I call them. And that's like, they're always looking at the next mountain, not necessarily looking and enjoying the view when they get to the top of one. And so
it's funny though, right? Because it may not be ideal, because it's nice to enjoy what you've achieved. But I think at the same time, that mentality you just described is what continually drives you to try and do more, which is good in a way, as long as you can take some time off and get away from it at times and realize it's not life and death.
So what are some ways that you take some time off? Like, when you've talked about like resting and not just like gas pedaling all the time, what are some ways that you like rest, whether it's daily, weekly, monthly, quarterly, however you do it?
Yeah, I think for me, the biggest thing is I enjoy working. So I find that I don't necessarily need that, 1 month vacation to get away from it all, because I get sort of a bit keen to get back to work. But it's more on a daily basis to me that planning my day out is absolutely crucial. So that means, each night I'm going through the day, right, what's the plan for tomorrow? Not only what do I have to achieve, but I have flexibility of doing it any time of the day because I control my own schedule. So it's like, well, how am I going to go about achieving that? So when am I going to do my exercise? When am I going to, go for a lunchtime walk or whatever it is? When am I going to get out in the afternoon? And continually doing more micro blocks than saying, right, I'm going to sit down at the desk from 9 o'clock to midday, have half an hour lunch and then come back. I more try and break my day up into sort of 2 to 3 hour blocks and have sort of a break in between each, because I really feel that allows me to perform best in each of those 2 or 3 hour blocks, but it also makes it far more sustainable, both during that day but over the longer course. And over the time, to me personally, that served me well. I jump up out of bed each morning going, right, this is what I want to achieve today, and I'm excited by that. So that works well for me. I think for other people who are needing more solid breaks, then it's really a matter of having those week off on a regular basis to sort of refuel and get that vigor back. But personally, that's not me.
I definitely feel you. I think it's funny that me and Chloe specifically are talking to you, because I am very much the plan the night before. This is when I'm going to exercise. I'm going to meditate here. I'm going to do some breathing here. I'm going to take a walk after dinner. And it's like time blocked out. Chloe's like, I'm feeling like I'm going to go for a walk right now, or don't talk to me the whole weekend because I'm just off. Or like, Chloe, you can speak to that, but it's just interesting the different ways people fit it in.
And I think that's the reality of success though, right? Is we're not all the same. And it takes us a while to learn what we are. So, in the case of you two, you've both just described different habits, but they work really well for you as individuals. So, and I really believe that's the key, is it's finding what works for us and then, going with it.
Absolutely. The key is to know yourself 100%.
Speaking of knowing yourself, perfect transition into Pylot.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit more about Pylot, how you got there, like the transition from what you're doing previously, your performance, moving into mental fitness, all that kind of stuff. Talk to us about Pylot, what it is and how you got there.
Yeah. So I guess it's probably worth taking a step back, which was when it came to sports science, my specialty was looking at what's called heart rate variability, which is reasonably common now. Wasn't so common when we started in 2000, so 24 years ago. But it was trying to monitor athletes and determine how ready they were to perform, how ready they were to train hard, or when they needed rest. So I say that because that general concept is also what we're trying to now achieve from a mental performance point of view. The idea for Pylot itself came about, as I mentioned before, which was when I had these hours and hours of meetings in the morning and then go to do my deep work, which I considered my priority. And it was just like, whoa, I just can't. I'm just really struggling and questioning myself. Am I fatigued? Is this real? Or am I now just being lazy? And it was like, okay, well, maybe I combine my previous world of being able to monitor things to try and answer that question. So we really set out on a mission going, well, if we grab a few sensors, we have a bit of a play around, maybe we can find out if we can actually answer this question of if it's laziness or mental fatigue. And you always, I think as an entrepreneur, it's always good to underestimate the size of problems because otherwise you'd never start. But that particular problem took us a long, long time to solve and a lot longer than I ever expected it to take. But we started looking at the use of EEG and also the use of heart rate variability to see what changes were associated with sustained mental intensity. And we ended up, moving from just monitoring us as individuals while we work to actually doing controlled trials to see these changes. So that was sort of the idea behind Pylot and the start of it, but it's been a far more challenging project than I ever expected. My previous work was all around the use of off-the-shelf technologies to monitor athletes, and therefore my part of that was the science or the algorithms. When it came to Pylot, there was that side of it, the algorithms or the use of the data, but then there was turning that into an experience in software, and then there was actually putting that into unique hardware because there wasn't anything off-the-shelf suitable. So suddenly, instead of just having this one part, there's these three monster parts to actually be able to achieve a successful product. And I think we underestimated every one of those phases. The research and the algorithms in itself, which we thought might be a few months project, ended up taking us 2 years just to do the scientific experiments and then come up with something that actually worked. And then, from that point we think there's actually something here that could lead to a product. Let's start turning that into a product. And then more years of work come from a product development point of view.
So when you're saying algorithms and you're saying like the science and these types of things, like just so that I'm just going to place like dumb like buyer for a second, as if I don't know anything about brain science or like physiology, but you're looking at EEG, so that's measuring brain waves, and then HRV, and all on the front of the skull. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's yes, correct. So EEG measuring brainwave activity, so it measures sort of micro voltages on the scalp, so on the skin. So you're not actually having to do anything to your brain. There's little sensors sitting on your forehead. Now, there's no stimulation. We're not trying to change anything. It's all about measurement. And the same with heart rate variability. So we use a PPG sensor, which is similar to what you'd find in a Fitbit or a Garmin or an Apple Watch on your wrist. But the forehead actually has lots of blood vessels there where we can do that equally well. So therefore you end up with a headband product because you need to be on the head for the EEG, where you're able to measure all of this. Those sensors in themselves, especially the EEG, people may think that they've seen things online in a medical or a research context where someone's got a full skull cap on and leads coming out of their head everywhere. That's also an EEG. For us, that was never an option. We were always looking at trying to make a product that was useful for the general consumer. and therefore it needed to be small, comfortable, and also reasonably priced. And therefore, we have what's called a single channel EEG, whereas a medical grade might be, for example, a 21 channel EEG. And also the things like the sampling rate are reduced. So you're talking basically a simplified piece of medical equipment to put it into a consumer product.
Got it. And so it's taking those measurements of EEG, the EEG measurements and the HRV measurements, which EEG is really brainwaves. And then you have an algorithm that you've also developed that analyzes the HRV and the brainwaves. And based on fluctuations in those two things, you're giving the consumer a readiness score or what's the end consumer get from these sensors being on their head and this algorithm analyzing this data?
Really good question. So there's a huge amount of data that you get. So our EEG, for example, samples at what's called 512 hertz, which is 512 times a second. It packages that up into 1 hertz and spits it out to our software. So every second, we're getting about 10 values. And that's no good to an individual user. Even me sitting here, if I was sitting here looking at it, it's just information overload and meaningless. So really the thing that took us a long time is what information there is meaningful, and then how do we turn that into something where the user can extract meaning simply from it. So when we set out about our research initially, we had several hypotheses. We thought that yes, there's things about mental performance we could measure that related to what we call task performance or what you're actually doing. Some of those hypotheses were wrong. There was expectations where we thought, this type of brainwave would have the closest relationship when it was actually the inverse of that, and there was other things that had a closer relationship. So we end up getting to a point where we were able to measure mental performance, and it had a relationship with task performance, and then turn that into a software experience. That's saying something in a sentence that really took us 2 years. Like even the question of how do you measure task performance? Because if I'm sitting here working, what is performance? So at that point, we actually had to take a step back, and we focused on serious or hardcore esports or, computer game players, because they had to use their mind to perform, and we could measure their performance. So they were basically like my background of working with an athlete, but now their key measure was their mind. Whereas, if we tried to do that with workers, we wouldn't have had that task performance measure. So being able to look at a competitive esport athlete and go, well, they've won or they've lost, they've got all these stats in their game. Now we have a measure of performance, and we can start looking at how task performance matches mental performance.
Damn, that makes so much freaking sense. So then today, the consumer product that you created after some of this research, which we'll dive into a little bit more in a second, but what are the users getting? Like, they strap this thing on. What is the user experience like, and what did they get to see, and what's it like for them?
Yes, good question. And you basically repeated the question you asked a minute ago that I didn't answer correctly. No,
it's okay.
We measure a whole range of metrics under the hood, or the algorithms we had. But what we determined is there was 2 key measures that actually had the biggest impact on task performance, and therefore we can give feedback back to the user. The first one is mental fatigue. So basically, are you mentally becoming tired from ongoing mental load or cognitive load? And that's generally a pretty slow changing measure. So, you sit down at the start of the day, and generally your mental fatigue's low, and over the day it might build up if you don't have adequate breaks, etc. And what we found there is that if it gets too high, then it has a negative impact on performance. If it's low or moderate or up to a certain level, then it's all fine. This is where it's very similar to sport. It's like going for a run, right? It's, you head out the door and you feel fine. But if you keep doing that for half an hour, maybe still fine. If you keep doing it for 2 or 3 hours, fatigue starts to have an impact. And at that point, you're either starting to slow down, or you're starting to work harder to sustain the same pace. And it's very similar from a mental performance point of view. So that was the first key metric that we found useful, which is mental fatigue. The other one grabbed us by surprise. So we really thought this higher EEG brainwave activity associated with beta brainwaves would be most useful, because it's around or people associate it with focus or in a deep attention. We actually found that wasn't the case, and there was actually slower brainwave or alpha brainwave activity that continually had a really strong correlation with task performance. And that grabbed us by surprise, but we went back and looked at some of the published this research that was looking at mainly mathematical challenges or sometimes driving performance. And there was this constant referral to, flow state. As a scientist, I hate the term flow state because I think it's I understand it being vague, but it's a bit fluffy from a scientific point of view. But a lot of the research would say, this term flow state is associated with alpha brainwave activity, and that's where performance is optimized. And that's exactly what we found. It wasn't the intense focus that was leading to the best task result. It was this flow state or this relaxed attention whereby you're still completely engaged in what you're doing, but you're not got a high level of intense focus on something specific. It's more relaxed, sitting back and taking it all in and being able to comprehend everything at the same time. And that was the other one we settled on, is this alpha brainwave activity, which we now in our app call flow because people can associate with that.
Interesting.
That's awesome. And so then people have this, do they wear this headband like 24/7? Do they wear it just when they're working? Like how does that work?
Yeah, so it's just really when you're doing your key tasks. So whether that's working, if you're a worker, with study, we still have some gamers who are interested in using the product. So it's whatever it is your key focus mental activity. So for me, that's sitting here at the desk working. Once you're up and moving about, we're starting to do a bit of research in that space, but the reality is at the moment, we're not set up to do that. The product is a headband, and even though it's slim and comfortable, people probably feel a bit conscious, walking around with a headband on. And also the sensors are not as good when there's a lot of movement. The same as, say, with an Apple Watch, if there's a lot of movement with the arm, heart rate can become less accurate. There's lots of moving on the head and the sensors are a little less accurate as well. While sitting here at the desk, we get really good data and we're able to provide live feedback directly via the app on Mac or Windows.
And so the app would tell you when you're getting fatigued or maybe that you need to take a break then?
Yeah, exactly. So there's a couple of key things we try and answer. So with these two measurements of fatigue and flow, it's like, well, when am I in flow or in the highest level of flow? So that's a little bit individual. So for me, I'm a morning person and I wear Pylot throughout the day. And I can see that from 7 o'clock in the morning till midday, that flow gradually creeps up. And after midday, it gradually starts going down. And come 4 o'clock in the afternoon, there's very little point me probably trying to do anything that's deep work or intense. So whereas for some other people, my colleague, then he's the complete opposite. In the morning it's very low, and into the early evening it's still on the rise because he's that evening person. So for one, we can help you identify what time of day is best. The other one is how long should your work blocks be. So if I'm going to sit down and I'm going to do an intense block of work, should I be here for an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, etc., before flow starts to drop off and mental fatigue starts to kick in? And so, once again, if I use myself as an example, that's around the 90-minute to 2 hour mark before I start to see a decline. So that allows me very easily to plan my day. So when I'm looking at planning my day for tomorrow, then I'm like, right, the key stuff needs to be done in the morning. My work blocks should ideally be 90 minutes, a maximum of 2 hours. Then I have a short break. And then when I get to later in the afternoon, that's time when I might do my emails or some admin type tasks where I'm not having to think too much. And while you can learn this about yourself, not every day is the same. So the idea of having live feedback allows you to make decisions on the fly because today might be different to what your normal pattern is. And the example that I'd say there was one day a couple of months ago where I think it was a Wednesday afternoon, and I'm like, right, 4 o'clock in the afternoon, but I'm really close to getting this task done. And yes, Pylot says I'm fatigued, but I reckon another 2 hours and I've got this knocked off for the week. So I did that and then hop up the next morning, and right from the start, my mental fatigue is really high. And that day was almost a complete write-off from doing anything productive because I burnt myself the day before. So even though I knew these general patterns about myself, I made a poor decision, and therefore, Pylot was able to give me feedback on how I might better adjust on the fly to accommodate those decisions.
That is such cool feedback. So not only does it give live feedback, you can watch it and see it as you're kind of doing it. It allows you to collect data over time about yourself and make more informed decisions and plan your life in accordance to your mental and emotional energy. That's fire. Is there anything that you have noticed either in your own data or the initial users or in the testing that you did that knocks people out of flow most often?
I think, this is no surprise. It's just those interruptions, right? Like if you're sitting here and you've got complete control of your environment, and it's got no crazy sounds, maybe you've got music or whatever it is that works for you, getting phone calls, getting people walking in, having constant meetings, they're the things that really knock you off that train of thought, and it knocks you out of flow. And, at that point, it's difficult to get back into that state without resetting all of those things. So I don't think there's anything necessarily new and groundbreaking there. It's more just, I would say, trying to help people use Pylot to identify their key periods and protect those key periods. So, using the example from my data, if that's from, for example, 8 to 11 in the morning, try not to do anything that's, meetings, or, going away and, talking to too many people, having an open door policy at that time. It's more, that's my protected time. That's when I do the important stuff. I'll do the emails, the meetings, etc. outside of those times.
Dang, that makes a lot of sense. That's interesting. Something that we see a lot, actually, there's tons of, I mentioned a couple already, other EEG companies, some near infrared companies that are doing like this brain monitoring type stuff. How are you guys different? Why did you decide to create a new innovation as opposed to use something that is kind of off the shelf, like you mentioned earlier?
Yeah, the reality is we would love to use something off the shelf because it would have been way quicker and cheaper. There just wasn't anything really suitable. So we started looking at this originally in 2019, so 5 years ago, and we've chosen a EEG sensor that's pretty much off the shelf. It's got the most research behind it for a consumer grade sensor, but the form factor it was currently sold in was uncomfortable and ugly, etc. So that's why we ended up going down the path of creating this ourselves from that point of view. We also couldn't find any other hardware that had a combination of suitable EEG and heart rate variability. Right now, since then, there's a couple, but it's very difficult to get accurate heart rate variability. And I've tried a few products that offer that, and they're probably not great from the heart rate variability accuracy point of view. But I think the thing that really differentiates us is the use of that data. And so I'm not aware of other products that have already launched that are actually trying to monitor mental performance from a productivity or a learning and education point of view. There's products like Muse which offer a nice hardware solution but have a very different software experience in terms of trying to help the user have benefits in other areas. So, it's really a use case. So if you're looking for something that's around mental performance and boosting your productivity, then we feel that Pylot's the best option. If you're looking something for, say, relaxation, sleep, meditation, then Muse is a better option than us because their software's focused in that area and we're not. So I think that's largely the differentiator.
Interesting. So then what would you decide? What would you say your ideal customer is, like in your head? Like who's your ideal customer and like what's the dream outcome you have for them?
Yeah, so our ideal customer is someone who's looking to get the most out of their day. That may not necessarily be, traditional productivity at work. Maybe it's study. Maybe it's even gaming, or maybe it's something else that's important from a mental performance point of view. But they're a high achiever. They're looking to improve where they're at the moment, and they're wanting to do that in a smart way. They're not looking to just grind 10 or 12-hour days to success. They're looking to try and manage their mental energy to be able to get the most out of themselves. Additionally, they're definitely tech savvy. We're a product that's a new form factor, and even though it's very easy to use from a technology point of view, we do find that we have the best relationship with people who are pretty tech savvy, who are comfortable taking new products and new form factors and being able to use them.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense.
I think the other part of your question was, where do we want to get to? What do we want to achieve?
Wow.
Our mission really is to be able to empower people to get the most out of their work or their hobby and to be able to feel as though they're succeeding in that space or meeting their potential in that space.
I want to dive a little bit more into the science now. So, I saw on your website, Pylot's supported by over 4 years of research. Can you give us a little bit of a summary of, generally the research that Pylot is based off of? And then a little bit of a summary also on your own research that you conducted.
Yep. So, like I mentioned before, we originally set out this on a project thinking that maybe we can answer this and help ourselves. And when we started reading the peer-reviewed research, we found, especially in the area of EEG, there's a lot of conflicting research. Now, you'll read one paper and they'll say mental fatigue is associated with this type of EEG activity. And you'll read the next and it'll be completely different. And we got to a point going, well, there's obviously something here. There's a lot of research on it that's using EEG around mental fatigue, for example, but it's not clear on how it should be done. So at that point, we went, okay, we'll start our own research. And our first point of call here was this, what we end up terming internally a torture test. It was a 1 hour controlled trial where you basically had to follow some dots on a screen and they'd change color and you had to pick the one that changed color retrospectively. It was hard, right? It was like an hour of this 15-second challenge over and over and over and over and over. But we made it into a competition so that, we ended up having people who were coming back and wanting to do it again to try and excel and beat their mate or whatever. And that allowed us to get quite a lot of data with people having this intense mental load over a reasonable amount of time. And from a mental fatigue point of view, we then looked at that data and were able to clearly identify some shifts we were seeing between the first 10 minutes of the test, for example, to say the last 10 minutes, and how their performance in the test changed along with their EEG and HRV response. So that allowed us to, for example, set up this, what we call a draft or a trial algorithm for mental fatigue. But then it's a matter of, does that apply in the real world? And that's when we started to use gamers. And we do this in two ways. So we had about 15 gamers each play what's called League of Legends, which is this super competitive, multiplayer game, etc. And they were very serious, hardcore gamers. Some of them played over 100 games for us. One played up to 1,000 games over several months. So, each game's about half an hour, so it's huge volumes of data. So that allowed us to get this real world data to match to our models. But we then also looked at when they played for like 5 or 6 hours straight, what did we see? And when they were in a game, how did that change to the breaks between games? And so allow us to validate the models we're seeing from a research or controlled environment and validate it in a real world environment, and then relate it to the performance they were having in those games as well. So for us, the mental fatigue model or algorithm was very, very difficult to develop. The flow algorithm that I mentioned before as being probably the best predictor of task performance, we almost stumbled across it because it wasn't what we were looking for. It was more, we had this measure and we just had it there just in case it showed anything. And it turned out it was the thing that showed a whole lot. So it was almost by accident that it kept coming up being a really strong predictor in all of these trials that we were conducting.
Damn, that's cool. Is this like research that is like published anywhere, or like is there any like people can look at some of the stuff, or is it like
no, we haven't published it externally. We have a white paper which details it all, but we haven't published it in a peer-reviewed journal. We did partner with a couple of universities to sort of piggyback on some of the research they were doing. So that was the other bit, that we were doing it in very much a real world environment, but they were doing some of their research in a more controlled environment. So we had some good relationships with a couple of universities. We were able to basically jump in on their research and say, look, we're not getting you to change anything you're doing looking at, say, fatigue, but we want to be able to get this type of data and look at the results. And that was more a validation process, because generally when you're doing academic research, the sample size is not particularly high. I think from memory, we had one university relationship and there was about 10 subjects that did 2 trials across these 2 days. Whereas for us, we had about 100 individuals do our 1 hour, torture test. And so, the combination of the volume of our own research and then validated on piggybacking on some university research allowed us to sort of achieve it. But none of our stuff specifically has been published in peer-reviewed journal.
Such an interesting, like, out in the real world type model or testing model versus like hardcore ivory tower in the research lab type of stuff. Like, it's like interesting that as more of these consumer technology devices get out there, like the mass amounts of data that you can start to get and validate and do things with. Like, I think that's really cool.
And definitely that was one of the, like I mentioned before, the challenges we saw in some of the peer-reviewed research we're reading and the conflicts there. And that was one of the things that really jumped out at me. A lot of the challenges they use for, say, mental fatigue are repetitive mathematical challenges. And if you're sitting in a lab doing maths for hours on end, you get to a point where you just don't care anymore. So the change that the researchers, I think, are sometimes seeing is not so much mental fatigue, but just giving up. So we found some research that was doing similar measurements, but on pilots, why they were actually flying. And that started to match what we were seeing in these gamers. And we're like, suddenly, instead of giving up, they can't give up, right? So things continue to progress. And that's the exact same things we were seeing in the gamers. I'm not saying gamers are pilots, obviously they're very different, but the gamer is completely engaged and dedicated to their game. So they'll keep pushing themselves, where someone in a lab doing repetitive maths challenges probably doesn't have that desire to keep pushing through.
That's a really interesting point. Yeah. Do you have any plans to kind of validate how the pilot improves performance over time, and maybe looking at the use over a long range of time?
Yes, we would love to do more controlled research in that space. I think the biggest hiccup with answering a question like you just said is how it improves performance. What is performance? Because, coming back to, like we said at the start, like we use gamers because we can measure performance, but most of our users who are the consumers of our product are not gamers. So they're using it in a work environment and they're able to give us subjective feedback, but it's very difficult to get objective feedback, to say that they actually improved in terms of this way. So what we would really like to do there is work with a couple of companies who can do this on a larger scale and have some type of internal tracking tool, whether it be software developers and the sprint points they've done, or they're looking at their tickets they've finished. They've still got weaknesses for sure, those models, but at least it's starting to try and, being able to measure performance in some way.
Yeah, that's interesting. Something that I couldn't help thinking about, I've got a research background too, is like confounding variables. Like, how did you control for those? Like diet, sleep, nutrition, or diet and sleep are kind of similar, but their environment, like how did you control for any of these or account for these in your analysis?
So when we did our control trials, so these torture tests, then really what we're looking at is the change from start to end. So we're basically setting a baseline for where the individual was at the start of the test, compare to where they were at the end of the challenge. The biggest thing is not just what you just said, like sleep, etc., which obviously have an impact, but probably the variation between individuals. Any type of physiological measure between individuals varies, in terms of the baseline. So one of the things that our algorithm does is it has a general starting point that's applicable to everybody, but over time it calibrates to that individual user. And that's probably the biggest way we account for what you just said. At that point, once we've got a strong calibration, we've got enough data from an individual user, then we can start seeing the impact of small changes like you just mentioned. But in our research, it was more looking at change in that controlled period as opposed to the state they went into the test at the start.
Got it. Interesting potential expansion on some of that. Do you guys integrate with like Apple Health or anything like that yet, to where people could start to integrate their Pylot data with Apple Health data or Garmin data or anything like that?
Not as yet. It's definitely on our roadmap. Some are easier than others. Something like HRV, we could very easily integrate with Apple Health because it's already something they have in there and there's a standard protocol for doing it. EEG, there's no standard protocols. Everything's way messier in that world. And so it becomes more difficult to pass across some type of standardized measure to another platform.
Nice. I like that. What's the, I'd be curious, like as a founder, we spend a lot of time being punching bags. So what's the biggest skepticism that people have, or the biggest, like, I don't know about that you've gotten around Pylot as you've been like off to the races, watching comments, emails, all sorts of stuff come through?
Do you remember those wristbands that had a hologram or something in them years and years ago?
Oh, God, yes.
Yes, we've had a few people sort of say, this is just the hologram of now, or whatever those things were called. And I always find that frustrating because I'm pretty science-based and I'm a really big skeptic. And I really don't want to try and sell a promise that we can't deliver on. Like, we get a lot of questions about Pylot. Can it do this? Can it do that? And I'll just have to say, look, in theory, yeah, it can help there, but we haven't done the research, so I can't tell you. And I guess that's why as a punching bag, when it says we're sort of non-scientific, I always find it a bit frustrating. There's always more validation we can do from a scientific point of view, and we always want to do that. But yeah, I always try and probably undersell. I'm the worst salesperson in the world. Probably try and undersell what we can do as opposed to oversell it. So I guess that's probably the biggest punching bag aspect. The other one, I guess, is, when you're making a new product, you want negative feedback. You want to hear from people who are having a frustration so that you can make changes. The number of pre-launch trials that we did with different versions of the product, we went through those, when people say, oh, look, this is really interesting data, but this thing sucks to wear and, blah, blah, blah. And at the time, you're like, oh, damn. But it helps you get to a better point. So, I guess that's at times you feel like a punching bag in those scenarios, but it's for the greater good, and it's just a matter of trying to absorb the blows in the meantime.
I like that. So another question I'm curious about is, like, if I'm a customer, I'm a Pylot customer, I'm wearing it all the time, tracking my stuff. Is there anything outside of the band and the data that I get? Like, is there any like customer experience type stuff that you do, like community, or what's it like to be a Pylot customer outside of just wearing the band?
Yeah. Good question. So look, we're still delivering pre-orders. So our user base at the moment is small, ramping up each week as we ship out more pre-orders. But initially, what we really want is I want to have a conversation with you as a user, so that you can tell me what you found good, what you enjoyed, what you found a frustration, what you would like Pylot to do that it doesn't already do. So, and maybe I can give you some coaching from our experience that helps you along the way, and you give us that feedback around, how you'd like Pylot to improve. And so it's really that one-on-one relationship. We do have a Discord server that's mixed in terms of how active it is, but definitely as we start shipping pre-orders out, then that's the place that we want the community to start discussing different ideas. And I think that when we did pre-launch trials with some of the pre-order customers, there's a whole lot of questions we get. Oh, it'd be great if it did X. And there's a whole lot that we can do that we don't do. And it's a matter of us trying to find what the majority of our users want the product to do next on top of that sort of core offering that I mentioned earlier.
What are some of the most common themes?
There's a lot that are around integration, like you asked a moment ago. Whether that's integration in terms of matching that up with health and wellness data, say from Apple Watch, or whether that's integration with like activity devices that monitor your computer activity. So, for example, there's a tool called Rescue Time that basically monitors what you do on your computer and tries to determine what's productive and what's not. So am I in a Word document or am I in Facebook, for example? So both of those are really interesting to us because you integrate with, say, Apple Watch data. What's the impact that 8 hours of sleep has last night compared to 5 hours of sleep? Or what's the impact that a lunchtime walk has on your mental performance after lunch? And then integrating with the likes of Rescue Time is really interesting because now we're starting to get a pseudo measure of task performance. So now we're saying, oh, well, this was your mental performance. This was a bit of a guide to your task performance. And putting all of that data together, we're now just one piece in this larger puzzle, but it becomes far more powerful with each individual piece having a bit more meaning.
Very interesting. I like this kind of stuff. I'm a growth hacker, performance hacker too. So.
And there's also a lot of questions we get we never, ever expected. So, we've had no experience with people experiencing ADHD, for example, and it's got quite a lot of interest in that area. And that's one of those areas like, well, in theory, we should be able to help. We haven't done any specific research, so we're interested to learn from those users and potentially do some research. Another one, we've had a few people who are professional online gambling, like poker players, something we have no experience in, but it's like, oh, well, that's interesting as well. So you also get a lot of different use cases that you didn't originally think were sort of what you were targeting, but the product still has applicability to.
Once you ship it, anything is possible. Speaking of shipping things, I'm always curious, people and founders that have these health and wellness technologies that aren't maybe necessarily as rigorously tested as they could be, or different, like there's always more, like you mentioned, but nonetheless ship it and get it out to people. Like, how do you manage that? How do you manage like what you get out to people and what you're willing to say it does and things like that? How do you manage that as far as marketing and sales and all those types of things and keeping people safe and like informed?
Yeah, good question. So like I mentioned before, I'm the worst salesman ever and probably undersell things. So all of the sensors we use in our product have been used in peer-reviewed research, just not combined in our product. So there is some research to back up the sensors we're using and how they're used, but not in a pilot product and not with the algorithms specifically like we're using. So I guess that's where it's what we say it delivers and what we say it might help with, but we can't make any promises because we haven't done any trials in those areas. And then trying to get the feedback from early users. That's 100% the key is, if we're getting feedback from users and people saying, oh, this is garbage or this is off the mark, then we're like, oh, this is not good. Whereas if we're getting feedback which is saying, right, this is actually really helpful, it's matching how I feel, it's allowing me to do X, Y, and Z, then we know we're heading down the right path. We have a pretty clear expectation of what we expect to see because we've been through so many trials pre-launch with different variations of the product. So we know that, we had a product, one of the first prototypes that we sent out to about 20 pre-order customers just to trial. And the general feedback was, well, the hardware's not great to wear, but the data's great. And so it was like, perfect. We just need to fix the hardware comfort. And so, that was a focus for us, in order to ship. So we know that customers will probably find the data beneficial and, therefore it's the expectation that we have. At the same time, once we get it out to more and more people, we expect more and more variation in what we hear back.
So y'all sell a neurotech device, if you will, but do you view yourself as a hardware company or as a data company?
That's a great question. No, we're very much a software science company. The hardware for us is a tool to allow us to give a benefit to the user. I don't think we're a hardware company, and longer term we can definitely see ourselves being in various form factors that maybe we don't have ownership of but are more convenient to the user, and we're 100% fine with that because our true expertise is not on making a unique piece of hardware. Our true expertise is being able to turn the sensor data into meaningful information and beneficial information for the user.
So what is that future vision for Pylot? Like, what would be your dream outcome in 10 years from now?
So there's already some research that uses EEG within the ear. So imagine a truly wireless earbud, whereby exactly it's like the AirPods that you're wearing, whereby you've got EEG in there and you can already get HRV in an earbud. So there's definitely a future where we can see having our sensors in a truly wireless earbud and then being able to give the same product experience that we're able to do at the moment, but just in a far more convenient form factor. And this is where we're very much the data and the algorithms behind that. We're not the ones that want to make a truly wireless earbud. We mentioned before that we've been with Logitech and Jaybird before. We've been involved in the development of truly wireless earbuds without sensors, and they're very hard. We definitely don't want to make one with sensors because that's it's a 5-year job in itself if you have the right expertise on board.
That's wild. Speaking of this, are there any innovations or like tools outside of Pylot that are on your radar as someone who is in this space?
Yeah, there seems to be more and more devices coming out in this area. So definitely, as I mentioned 5 years ago, I think there was really just early Muse products, and they're still the sort of main player in the space of consumer EEG. But there is other products coming out. We haven't tried a lot of them, and the main reason is I think a lot of them are still pre-launch. So I think the challenge in this space is everyone's trying to understand where the user is, what the user's after, and there's a lot of pre-launch hype to get interest and feedback before the product launches. So there's been a few Kickstarter campaigns that have either never launched or, after several years are still yet to launch that are, potentially similar to what we have. So yes, there's not too many that are actually on the market at the moment.
Y'all are on heads. Like you guys have devices on heads live, like right now.
We have products, yeah. So as I said, we've not got heaps. We're shipping more and more every week. So we were lucky enough to have reasonable pre-order demand. So we're still meeting that pre-order demand. But yes, we're on heads and getting real person feedback, which is great.
So cool.
Super exciting.
One thing, we didn't put it on here specifically, but I'd love, what is your 20, 30, 40, 50-year vision for all of the AI tools, the neurotech tools, the biotech tools, all of this data, all these different algorithms, personalization, what do you think it looks like in the future? Like,
Yeah, to me, I'd simplify it into a form factor that is super convenient, so you almost don't know it's there. So, maybe the 5 to 10 year form factor is a truly wireless earbud. Beyond that, who knows where we'll end up, but really convenient, minimalist form factor. And then the other one, which we already touched on, is integration with your whole ecosystem of data. Because to me, that's when it becomes really powerful. Any piece of data in isolation is interesting, but being able to combine it all and say, well, we saw this, but this was the reason for it, and therefore you can action it in this way, that's where it really becomes powerful. In theory, that doesn't sound too complicated, but these things always take a whole lot longer to actually achieve than what they do in your mind. So I would imagine that that's probably more a 10-year than a 40-year vision, but in 10 years we could have a reasonably minimalist form factor and be able to integrate with activity, health data, and have this better overall picture of being able to deliver a product. And then I think the longer term beyond that is probably giving feedback in a useful and timely manner. So rather than providing information that you have to look at and go, this is my time of day, or, I'm trying to answer this question, I can look at the data and get that back, is us being able to know that, Cody's had 5 hours of sleep last night, so right, this is what you need to do today to accommodate that from a work point of view and an exercise point of view. So it's a bit more proactive than just retrospective.
That's interesting. How do you view, or how do you feel like in the future, because Whoop has data like that, Garmin has data, Aura has data, Muse has data, all of these people have all this different types of data. How does, if you're thinking as a consumer, I want all these things to come together and tell me, do what you just said, but Pylot is separate from Whoop. And you have different corporate objectives because you are both companies and competitors in some way, if you will. How do I, as a consumer, combine those things? How does that work?
Yeah, it's messy, right? So, Apple Health seems to be the main place where people pull all of their data in, but that's not necessarily then allowing you to, as a third party, analyze all of that holistically and provide feedback. So I think in the short term, it really is about strategically selecting partners that you want to integrate with, and some are easier to do so than others. Some will have a public API where you can grab data, you could pull that in, and you could use that as part of your own experience, or vice versa. Longer term, I think that we really need to have some type of standardized protocol for the sharing of similar information. So I mentioned before, for example, with Apple Health, for things like heart rate and heart rate variability, there's standard protocols around the capture and analysis of that. For things like EEG, that doesn't exist at a consumer level. So, for example, Muse might get something, we might get something, and they're completely different because they're completely different sets of hardware done in different ways, etc. So being able to have some type of standardization there would be the ideal. Whether that can ever occur, you see this in a whole range of tech spaces, whereby you see it in the smart home space at the moment, where they're trying to settle on standardized protocol, and they're 10-year processes to get half the job done. So they're definitely not small tasks to sort of unify protocols in that way.
That's a good idea, though. I like that. I like that perspective of like a standardization process. All right, we went a little deeper into the future than we usually do because I'm super curious, but apologies. Let's bring this in for a landing. We have some signature questions we like to ask at the end as we're bringing this in. The first one is my personal favorite, but what's a question that you wish more people asked you?
When do you perform at your best is probably the one. It's that if we all knew when we each performed at our best, then we could leave you to do your thing at that time, and we could give you a call or send you a message when you're not at your best, and you're able to leave your best time to the things that are important to you, and I'll hassle you outside of those times. That would be the thing that I would love people to ask me, so that it's easier for me to protect my key times of the day.
So when do you perform at your best? We'll let everybody who watches the podcast know not to mess with you then.
100 in the morning is for me. So maybe I need to have a banner on all of my things saying, "Don't contact me now." Wait till this afternoon.
No email messages, Ben, in the morning, or Cody.
Exactly.
Ben, what's a partnership or connection that would really help you outside of them just giving you money?
Yeah, so definitely from a business point of view, I think for us, the key partnerships are going to facilitate the ability to put our hardware in convenient form factors and get it out to mass users. So having a headband, we're very aware that that's an early adopter product. It's for the tech savvy. For us, the next step is we need to be in a form factor that people are already using and our sensors can sort of slot in there. So they're the types of partnerships that we see as being most long-term beneficial to us.
I like that. Got it.
Makes sense.
It makes a lot of sense, especially since you consider yourself a data company, algorithm company.
Exactly.
Next question. Every podcast, we ask the current guest to leave a question for the next guest. So our most recent interview was with Mandy Potson, and she is from Availist. They help consumers in the food and beverage space. They help a lot of times when you're like on DoorDash, you're searching for what you want and you get not what you want, but whatever company can pay the most to be in front of your eyeballs. And that pissed her off. And so she created a product that actually helps new and emerging food and beverage companies get in front of consumers, like in the food and beverage space. So that's kind of what she's up to. And I framed that because her question is, what is the coolest or newest food or beverage product that you've seen recently or interacted with that you really were like, whoa?
Jeez. That's a tough question. Like coming from a scientific background, I'm always a skeptic in terms of a lot of supplements, etc. Right? To me, it's often the old staples that are the best ones, and I guess they're not new, but it's the biggest thing that I'd probably mention is the use of in elite sport, the use of high amounts of carb consumption during activity. So 10 years ago, people would generally say, oh, well, we're at 30 grams of carbs per hour in, say, a cycling event, where now they're looking at saying, look, it's all about 120 grams. So there's new companies that are helping elite athletes consume larger amounts of carbohydrates in a more convenient form factor. That doesn't specifically answer the question in terms of being a specific brand, but that's the area that I find quite fascinating at the moment from a nutrition point of view.
Yeah, that is really interesting.
That is cool. Yeah, I didn't even know that. That's kind of interesting. Okay, it's your turn now. It's a question that you'd like us to ask our next guest, who'd be someone just like you.
Yeah, I guess the question would be, what is the biggest challenge you have with your mental performance to achieve your life's goals?
I like this.
Wow, performance to achieve your life goals.
Ben, what would you say is the mental challenge that comes up for you?
Definitely for me, it was being able to manage my mental energy during the day. That was definitely the key for me, which I feel I don't get right all the time, but now I have a better handle on. But that's where I guess I'm very interested to see, what other people say in that space and what other challenges they have.
Heck yeah. I'm excited to ask the next person that question. That's a good one. I like that. Well, we appreciate you hopping on with us. Is there any place you'd like to direct people's attention besides trypylot.com, or any last thing you'd like to give people?
We're not active enough on social media. So, we've got our Instagram, but our website's probably the best place, and you could definitely join us on Discord from there. But yeah, I guess in terms of the general advice and suggestion, it's manage your mental energy to get the most out of your day. And that's what Pylot's offering. So if you're interested, check us out or throw us a question.
Fantastic.
Yeah. Cool.
Thank you so much, Ben. That was really, really informative. We're really grateful to have you on here.
Thank you very much for your time, guys. Enjoy it.
Yeah, thank you so much. And if you guys haven't yet already, please like and subscribe on YouTube. Love to have you there so you can see more people like Ben. Appreciate your time and see you next time. Peace.
Bye, everyone.